Hello, everybody. Hi. So we are gonna get started. The session you are all in is for state policy updates and opportunities for accelerating success. Some of the objectives of this session, we're going to review some legislative and administrative, I just combined those two words, policy changes and their implementation considerations from 2022. And then we're going to highlight some emerging potential policy changes in 2023 as we're going through the legislative session. And then we're also going to introduce, and some of you might already be familiar with, the Success Network Policy Committee. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are emerging from our first few meetings that we had with the policy committee. And then we're going to discuss with all of you how these changes will impact the field, if there are any other emerging changes that you think have significant impact. But before we do that, we're just going to get started with some introductions. So hi, my name is Laura Monteagudo. I am a policy and program manager with Ed Systems, and I am going to hand it off to Emily to introduce herself.
Good morning. Still, is this one? Okay, this thing is on. I don't know how to use it. This is great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Rusca. I'm Director of State Policy and Strategy at Ed Systems, and just love seeing many familiar faces and many new faces in the room. So thank you so much for being here with us today. And I will kick us off by just kind of situating. Many of you, I think, were in the room for the last session with Laz and Marcus talking about sort of the state policy vision around college and career readiness. So just to kind of emphasize that, there are a lot of different policy frameworks in our state that are all around education and career success broadly. And so we're going to touch on some of these today specifically, some updates to them specifically, but just wanting to basically hammer home the point that the work that we are doing, not only through the network, but also at a state policy level, is really about alignment, right? Alignment across secondary and post-secondary and workforce, and alignment across policy frameworks. And so saying the same thing in each of these frameworks, right? So that it's not one says one thing, one says something slightly different, producing confusion in the field and like, what the heck are you going to do with your students? So some of the seminal pieces of policy that really undergird our work around college and career readiness in the state and success ultimately in the state are some of those are on the screen here, right? So we've got the Post-Secondary and Workforce Readiness Act, which I know Amy lovingly calls the Power Act. She's been like trying to make Power Act happen for 6-7 years now, and I love that. But the Post-Secondary Workforce Readiness Act, which has 4 student-centered competency-based approaches to student readiness and success in post-secondary and career. We've got our economic development plan, which includes a lot of college and career pathway strategies, early college credit, alignment pieces. The Career Pathways Dictionary, which is the first of its kind resource that our state agencies pulled together and that we'll talk more about today. But that really puts the terminology and the definitions in the same place around college and career pathway systems across our state agency partners. We got the Dual Credit Quality Act, which really underlies a lot of the work, the really robust work in our state to scale up early college credit and strategic early college credit. So not what we call random acts of dual credit. We've got our CTE programming, our career and technical education through Perkins funding that happens throughout the state. And then another example certainly is the college and career readiness indicator that's included in our school quality framework under our state's Every Student Succeeds Act state plan. So all of them kind of have similar principles in place. There's a lot of pieces of language aligned across them. The component parts, part of the work of our state agency partners and work of our organization and our partners at ISAC and Advance is to help our state agency partners think about how do we make sure that whenever we're developing a new state plan for a different funding stream, making sure that it's aligned so that folks can build on the work that they've been doing.
And from here, we're going to move into some of the highlights from this past year in 2022. One of the biggest pieces is building on the PWR Act. So I like Power Act. So there's kind of 2 main lanes of this new amendment, if you will. And first, there are some district requirements laid out. First, in regards to the PACE framework. So the PACE framework, which I know came up in the opening session today, has historically started with grade 9. And some localities were moving it down to middle school. But with this new requirement, basically districts now have to extend the PACE framework down to 6th grade by electing in, or they can opt out of this by July of 2025. Same timeline by July of 2025, districts serving grades 9 through 12 are going to have to elect into or opt out the college and career pathway endorsements. So there's also outlined one endorsement for the class of 2027, two for the class of 2029, and then if districts have more than 350 students, a third for the class of 31.
And just to offer a little bit of an explainer on that one, it's two quick things. One, it's either just start implementing or opt out, right? If you start implementing and apply to offer a college and career pathway endorsement, you're good. Like, you don't need to do anything else. It's just do the regular process for CCPE. The 350 student threshold, it's the median number of students in for high school serving districts. It's the median number of students in those districts. So it's saying if you are a bigger high school serving district, essentially you need to be offering 3 or more at least 3 pathways for the class of 31. But again, the legislation offers language around sort of opting out by board decision. You have to take into consideration a few things if of any part of the legislation for districts, not for agencies. Agencies have to do what they have to do.
Which the agencies to support this, there's 3 kind of main things that they have to do. So update the PACE framework guidance down to 6th grade to help districts adopt that. That's going to be by July of 2023. So they're working away on that right now. And then also publish a database of employer partners for available to districts to kind of help with that implementation process. And then also just publishing additional resources to support this work. This is just to give you kind of a glance of, oh, do we have a question already? Yeah. Cool.
Is there already, or will there be a guidance for
Yeah, so the PACE framework is literally, and I don't know if we have anyone from ISAC in the room right now. I'm like quickly skimming the audience. The PACE framework, the state agencies are working on getting the PACE framework updated and published to the field by July 20th, the updated framework that will draw it down to the 6th grade. There are currently some examples of other districts, like on the ISAC website with all the resources. There are some existing examples. I know Travis from Hinckley is here, and they've drawn it down to the kindergarten level, actually. So there are some examples of local PACE like localized PACE frameworks that draw it down to younger grades. But the official like baseline resource document as a starting point, because of course this is something that is meant to be a resource, and then districts take it and adapt it and make it their own, or document what they're already doing. That will be available by this summer, and it's kind of in those final approval processes right now. It's a very good question. But yeah, the resources. There are many resources that already exist. Many of them are linked on our website at the Success Network and the PWR Act website, but more and more are forthcoming.
This is just some context about where we are as a state right now in relation to the college and career pathway endorsement. So you can see over the last couple of years, up to 596 students in 2022. The work is already started in a lot of places.
And this is based on districts opting in, right? Like this was not a requirement. Like this wasn't what 3296 did, is essentially said, let's default to having folks offer college and career pathway endorsements, and they can opt out if they're doing other things and all that kind of stuff. But this was purely districts saying, we want to do this. We want to opt in. So like this scale in a few years' time is actually pretty incredible.
Moving on, the next new policy change that happened in 2022 is an amendment to the Dual Credit Quality Act. It has kind of 3 main things. One big thing is that it extends the professional development plan provision to 2023. And then it also includes career and technical education teachers in that professional development provision. So that's a new addition. The original Dual Credit Quality Act did not include those CTE teachers. And then it also builds in allowances for mixed enrollment dual credit classes. So essentially, there were some areas where they were struggling with master scheduling because they didn't necessarily have enough students who were eligible placement purposes into dual credit courses, and they were running into challenges. So this basically allows them to mix classes of students who are taking the courses for dual credit, and providing some differentiated instructions with maybe students who did not place into the dual credit aspect of the course. And I know there's a lot of work going on some guidance for this. This is pretty new in Illinois, and even around the country. I know we were looking for examples, and struggling to come up with things. So there's a lot of guidance on this new piece in the works, but it's, I think, hopefully eliminating an obstacle, especially for smaller schools or maybe more rural communities, to offer more dual credit options. Do you have anything to add on this last piece?
Yeah, I would just say, like, generally, what the Dual Credit Quality Act does is it provides our state a framework of what we mean by quality dual credit, right? And we've got the model partnership agreement that was created as a result of that can serve as a default agreement between secondary and post-secondary districts. So including kind of baseline standards around how you're funding or paying for the course, who's responsible for that, what the sort of agreement could look like between secondary and post-secondary to hopefully help smooth out those processes. We know those can be sticky processes. And so what this amendment does is it extends some of the key pieces that were supportive of addressing teacher pipeline challenges, but also addressing those scheduling challenges. And then finally, making sure faculty feel like they are adequately aware, right? Like Laws in the last session was saying, like, I don't want, as a high school district administrator, I don't want to be a college, but they in District 214 are really scaling up a lot of dual credit. And what's needed is that the faculty and the community college and four-year institution partners that are working with secondary districts to know, when a partnership agreement is put in place, what the course is going to be, what the purpose of offering that course as dual credit with the high school partner is going to be. So that's kind of where that faculty notification of partnership agreements came into play. And again, we're kind of running through some of the latest updates. There's obviously in 2021, there was the whole education omnibus bill, so this is just meant to be kind of like, let's catch you up on some of the stuff that's happened in the last year and a half, 2 years. Yes. There's not currently funding, my understanding. I think there might be some in the governor's budget proposal. There's literally a bill going to committee today, I think, about, it's not technically scholarships for professional development plans, but it functionally could serve as scholarship funding for teachers pursuing professional development plans. So there's a lot of conversation around supporting that. And some of the conversations we've had with state agency partners as well has been, is there a way of doing pilot, some sort of pilot or some sort of, cohort model that could support institutions to have more teachers pursue professional development plans, get the right credentials, those kinds of things. So obviously we know that cost can be prohibitive of that. The last, one of the last pieces we got a couple more pieces from this last year, but just wanted to highlight, recognizing that this network is not only education partners, but also involves a lot of alignment with workforce. Continuing the theme of equity and emphasizing the importance of equity also in workforce development. There were a couple of commissions and task forces. There's always a commission and a task force afoot in our state, but there were a couple of key ones that happened last year and a little bit into 2021. The Governor's Commission on Workforce Equity and Access, and this was really kind of emerged from conversations around potentially consolidating our state agencies that use WIOA funding. The conclusion of that study was that they weren't going to consolidate the agencies, but there was a real need to dive deeper under the hood of why are we seeing inequitable access and outcomes in WIOA programming, particularly by demography. And so that commission really focused on user experience and thinking about what those key design elements would make the experience of engaging with our workforce development system more smooth and seamless for individuals using the system. So there's a final report that's forthcoming. I've been told it's due kind of any day. So stay tuned for that. Simultaneously, the IWIB, the Illinois Workforce Innovation Board, which governs our workforce development system in the state, they convened an equity task force, and they've published their final report on that. It had a number of different committees on kind of programming and policy and user experience to also highlight what can we as an IWIB do better? How can we think more critically about equity in our work and how can we kind of put forth better practices on that. And so some of the themes that they kind of came out emphasizing out of that work was that, you know, a culture of equity starts from the top and the bottom and needs to come from all sides, right? It needs to be embedded in our policies and our practices and in our funding streams. We need better data. One of the biggest challenges in education and workforce is that we never have enough data. You can never have enough data. And so recognizing that we need to have more data resources to really understand what's happening in the field more broadly and to be able to target solutions, right? As Amy said earlier, not to admire the problem, but rather identify where there's opportunities for different efforts. And then, you know, kind of diversifying leadership, prioritizing supportive services, investing in target populations that have been historically either actively excluded or really underserved. You know, Amy also kind of mentioned the inadvertent disincentives for working with different populations. And in our WIOA system, and this comes from the federal government too, it's not just like an Illinois challenge, this is a national challenge. There's kind of perverse incentives of serving the easiest to serve because the metrics are just get them placed as soon as possible into jobs. So we have to think critically about how we fund with our own state dollars, hopefully, programming that can actually reach folks who would benefit from more robust supportive services and programming. And then I'm just gonna keep cruising. You guys are gonna be hearing me for a minute here. So I know I mentioned the omnibus bill from 2021, HB 2170. It included all sorts of provisions, including one around accelerated placement. And so last November was the deadline for districts to submit their plan for automatic acceleration. There's always sort of been a possibility of automatic acceleration. So just automatically moving students into the next higher level of course, particularly in core academic coursework, math, English, and science. And this sort of formalizes that. So that was sort of just like an additional step on that road. The cool thing is that it also aligns to dual credit and transitional instruction. You know, it specifically names transitional instruction as one of those potential next level of courses. So really kind of trying to automate the seamless transitions for students down the line. And also kind of address something that we hear from the field a lot is that, you know, one of the challenges around getting students to enroll in early college credit or advanced coursework is folks think there's a lack of information. And when you talk to students, there's sometimes a lack of information and sometimes the adults are getting in the way, frankly, and our systems are getting in the way. And so trying to automate some of that and trying to reduce some of the user error, or human challenges around that is sort of where the spirit of this policy is coming from. So kind of putting that faith in the students to continue to accelerate and making that happen for them. Okay, and then I'm not going to go through every bullet point here. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the statewide Perkins model programs of study. So many, that's great. Okay, so basically the point of the Perkins model programs of study, the Illinois Community College Board asked for our help. We worked with advisory committees across a number. We can go ahead and advance the next slide because I'll just talk through the spirit of this. Across our different endorsement areas at laws and what I were talking about earlier, but basically saying, how do we offer programs of study that are aligned to the jobs that are growing, that have living wages? And how do we say, okay, starting with like what these programs of study guides do is outline kind of what a robust program of study in these different areas would look like based on statewide information, but the process by which they were derived is actually really powerful. So each area had an advisory committee that included secondary and post-secondary and employer partners. Each advisory committee looked at labor market information and said, where are there not only jobs growing, but also jobs with living wages, which is a very different threshold than minimum wage, as you can imagine. Starting there, saying what associate's or sub-baccalaureate degree programs will get you into those jobs, looking at the actual programs of study at the college level and at the literal syllabi and curricula for each of those programs of study at the college level, and then saying, okay, what are the highest value courses that could potentially be delivered at the high school level that would best accelerate a student once they get to the college level? So starting this back mapping process, which is really powerful. The guides include a description of the back mapping process. And so while the guides also say, like, here are what we would say the highest value courses would be, the point is to provide also a framework for communities to be able to say, if we did this in our own community and like use this same approach, maybe you'd come to different conclusions, right? There might be slightly different economic context, different jobs that are popping up in your area, but you have the tools to be able to say, okay, in our community, when we look at the jobs that are coming, when we look at the programs that exist, what would be the highest value for our students? What would be the most strategic for our high school students to then essentially boomerang, shoot them up to and through post-secondary to success. So more guides were produced in 2022. Now we have a complete set, and the education guide was also updated to include early childhood as a result of also the omnibus bill in 2021.
Back to me.
Back to you.
All right. Transitional instructions come up quite a bit today. It's not new necessarily. I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with it. Basically aiming to figure out who is not college ready in their junior year, remediate during the senior year, and provide that guaranteed placement. And just helping students get into their college level work earlier and increase their chances of completion. What there has been some movement on is just more implementation and scaling with both transitional math and transitional English. Transitional math was required or opt out in the PWR Act. So this is further along in the implementation with roughly 60% of high school serving districts currently offering at least one transitional math class. This graphic shows there's 3 courses that can be offered. So there are some districts that only offer one, some that offer all 3. It really depends on what that district chooses to do. There is an evaluation underway into effectiveness and student outcomes for transitional math. This is still in the process, aiming to be completed by fall of the next school year. And then in the fall, we are also planning to launch a virtual pilot for a virtual transitional math class, hoping that this will also provide more equitable access to transitional math as an option for students to address, again, those remediation needs.
And the goal of the virtual, remind me, the goal of the virtual course is to eventually have that be available to all districts, so that even if a district doesn't have the ability for whatever reason, resources, size, et cetera, to offer a transitional math course within their building, that they could have that as an offering for their students.
Yes. Transitional English is not required. So it's a lot, and it's also just newer. So it's much earlier in the implementation and scaling process. Right now, any schools offering transitional English are purely just opt-in. They wanted to do it. They saw the value in it. It's similar process in sort of setting it up to transitional math. But we do have a statewide advisory panel that meets monthly. This consists of all sorts of different people, post-secondary partners, community college representatives and faculty, high school teachers, and they do a lot of work. They put together all sorts of different resources, some to help with the implementation process, some even curricular resources, like a list of diverse text sets that meet the requirement for transitional English. So that is just really helping the state along in the process. I actually help support that. So if anyone here is like, yay, transitional English, come talk to me later, and I can help get you on that advisory group.
Yeah, and part of the reason why transitional math was an opt-out approach, because in Illinois, we don't do mandates, we do default and then opt-out. The reason why transitional math was emphasized in PWR Act is because, as you saw in all of the graphics shown earlier, that was the biggest area of need in developmental ed, or the highest rates of dev ed are in math. So, or have been, and we were at 50% just a few years ago. So it's really remarkable the progress that we've made, and in no small part due to work on transitional math. And I know many of you in the room are implementing it, and that is amazing stuff. I'm going to briefly touch on 2 things, and then we're going to get to present day and talk about what's coming up this year so far in our brief period. So many of you already know the ESSA College and Career Readiness Indicator. It's a multiple measures approach. It's meant to capture student readiness across a number of different avenues, at both academic readiness and kind of career readiness broadly. It is being reported. I know all of you districts are having to report it, but it's not currently on the report card yet. The intention was for it to be on the report card at this time, but due to sort of understandable data challenges around reporting very new types of elements for districts, it's not going to be published on the report card for a little bit, and it won't be weighed as part of the school accountability measure until 2025. So just wanted to kind of provide that update briefly. And then the last year update is that the Illinois P20 Council, which many of you are probably familiar with, but it's a cross-sector body that provides a lot of policy guidance to our state agency partners. It's the body that adopted the 60 by 25 goal. Last year, they decided to shift away from what were the prior structure, which included a lot of standing committees, including many of you were on the College and Career Readiness Committee that we staffed. So the P20 Council decided to move away from those committee-based structures and move towards kind of project-based structures. And so the first two projects that they've been or issue areas that they've been grappling with have been teacher pipeline issues and computer science. And I'll touch briefly on the computer science when we get to the legislative stuff in a second, but just generally they're moving towards these project-based structures. If there are particular issues that you think it would be worth having a state level entity through the P20 Council try to dive into, like, consider advocating for that with the governor's office, and we're happy to talk more about what that could look like. So 2023, this is a lot brighter on this screen than it is on my home screen. So we're gonna, similar to 2022, we're gonna just talk through what's emerging in the legislative session. There's like literally 5 committee hearings today about education and workforce in Springfield that we are obviously attending, just kidding. There are some new rules that have emerged around dual credit implementation, and then we're gonna talk a little bit about the Illinois Career Pathways Dictionary. And then the last topic for today, we'll get to the CCR Committee 2.0, AKA the Success Network Policy Committee.
Yes, and if you've been in any sessions where presenters were unavailable because they were in Springfield, Emily's about to tell you a little bit more about where they are and what they're doing.
They're in Springfield doing things. So I don't remember how many thousands of bills have got submitted this year so far, and we're not going to talk through all of them, but we decided to take a look at what's happening in Springfield. And I imagine that some of you in this room are more deeply involved in legislative action as well, but just to highlight some of the themes that are kind of emerging in some of these bills. And please don't quiz me on which bill number is which bill, because I need to go back to our tracker and remind myself of which one is which. But generally, there are a lot of themes that hopefully are resonant for those of you in this room, right? So we know we continue to have teacher pipeline challenges, right? And that is inclusive of getting career pathways teachers, that's inclusive of getting dual credit teachers. And so there's a number of different bills that try to address that. This House resolution is about sort of asking ISB to establish a teacher recruitment system. But these different strategies include things like funding for teacher externships in manufacturing in particular in one of these bills. Also subsidies for having another one. The Illinois Manufacturers Association is running a bunch of bills this year. So there's going to be a manufacturing sub-theme here. But subsidies for manufacturing employees to be CTE instructors in their local high school districts. So again, trying to kind of address some of those core challenges to teacher pipeline issues and recruitment and all that kind of stuff. Enhanced data reporting. So there's a few different bills that have to do with disaggregating more data. We're not going to be able to understand what our challenges are unless we're looking at data in a disaggregated way. One of the drums that we at Ed Systems beat virtually constantly is that remediation data should be disaggregated by student demography on our report card, which it is not currently. So we will continue beating that drum. But a lot of these bills kind of say we need more disaggregated data on our public dashboards in order to be able to make informed decisions, both as a state and local communities need those data to be regularly available to them. There are a bunch of bills pertaining to the Monetary Award Program, MAP, which is our state's need-based aid program. Some of it has to do with sort of preventing predatory practices, so kind of offering refunds to students who have had their MAP used at an institution that has employed predatory practices and ultimately has been kind of gotten in trouble for that. Some of the other MAP provisions are about scaling it to short-term programs, so short-term certificate programs, potentially being able to use MAP for those. So there's a lot of kind of emerging stuff around MAP. There's a lot of other things around regional manufacturing systems. Like I mentioned, the Illinois Manufacturers Association is advancing a very full package of bills that include things like funding for regional manufacturing academies and capital investments for manufacturing. One of the challenges that we know is in the field is that you can't use CTE dollars. High school districts cannot use CTE dollars for capital investments, which is a mind-boggling policy in my mind. But so trying to get some money to folks, if that policy is not going to change, getting money to folks so that they can have more facilities that are up to date, particularly in manufacturing, given who's advancing the bill. But there's also a bunch of stuff around how do we address kind of some of the core challenges to accessing and offering work-based learning, right? Employer concerns about liability. So how do we address insurance concerns? How do we address transportation, explore and address transportation concerns, and things of that nature. And also there's a bill about offering employee or employer tax credits that mirror the apprenticeship tax credit for employers, but for career development experiences. So those internship level experiences that are required under the college and career pathway endorsement. So again, recognizing that we're asking a lot of districts, saying, how do we get the other partners to be able to help the districts do what they want to do and what they are looking to do. There's a couple of youth employment strategies that I don't have the Senate bill on here, but I know it's on both sides of the legislature, but there's movement towards scaling some youth employment work. These computer science coursework and pathways bills are largely tied to that P20 Council conversation around computer science. And there's a lot of conversation around smoothing that post-secondary transition and transfer. So things like uniform admission, things like scaling up IAI, which I know Marcus, the Illinois Articulation Initiative, which I know Marcus and Laws were just talking about. And then there are a couple of bills around either removing or changing the foreign language graduation requirement, which we know is a sticking point for a lot of folks. I would say broadly, the way that we think about it at Systems is there are a lot of graduation requirements and districts are grappling with trying to make them all happen, right? And so the bill that I think, this bill 3307, I believe is the one that would offer, if it were to get passed, it would offer using CTE as a substitute for the foreign language requirement, just acknowledging that like it's so many requirements being placed on students and districts and figuring out how to like comprehensively grapple with them and address them. That's definitely not a full coverage of all the bills that are happening. That is just a handful that pertain to the themes that we are concerned about in the network. So I definitely am curious if folks have other thoughts about bills that they've seen pop up, but we'll keep cruising and then we want to get to discussion with you guys very soon here. So I will just briefly touch on these emerging dual credit rules. These tie back to HB 5506, that Dual Credit Quality Act amendment that Laura talked about earlier. But basically ICCB issued rules for implementing that policy. You know, first comes the law, then come the rules, and then you figure out, then comes the implementation. But then also simultaneously, the Higher Learning Commission, which is the accrediting body, has put out proposed new policy around faculty qualifications. Kind of taken together, these policies can hopefully help address some of the teacher pipeline challenges by having us think about what does equivalent experience look like for faculty that we could bring in to kind of beef up that pipeline. How do we address some of those master scheduling challenges that Laura was talking about earlier? And so what is next? We're really pushing hard for the ICCB to reconvene the Dual Credit Quality Act Model Partnership Agreement work group to create new resources around and standards around the mixed enrollment piece, because we think that that's potentially a very powerful tool, and also we don't want it to reproduce inequities or produce inequities in student access and success in early college credit. So trying to get new exhibits created so that districts and colleges know, okay, if you need to use the mixed enrollment provision, here is how you should think about it. And then trying to get just more guidance to the field. And so thinking about if there are ways that there can be institutions convened around developing guidance for how to implement these various things, including the equivalent experience component that's coming out of the Higher Learning Commission and the professional development plans and all that kind of stuff out of ICCB. And in all of that, I feel like Edith was talking about this earlier, our orientation in the network is state policy should be uplifting and built from innovative local practice. So figuring out what are the practices that are happening around the state that can be used as a guide for how we want to talk about it more broadly in the state.
All right. Emily mentioned earlier the Illinois Career Pathways Dictionary. A resource that was put together, all the state agencies, some other partners came together to put all of the terms around career pathways in one place that was accessible as a resource. We are currently working on updates to the Illinois Career Pathways Dictionary, partially just because it's been a while. It's been 5 years since the initial publication of the dictionary. And because that time has passed, we want to meet and support the additional implementation needs that have come up, especially with things like 3296. There's going to be quite a bit more scaling in the next few years, and just to evolving terms, evolving best practices. This is something that we're aiming to publish by the summer of 2023. We're looking right now to make it a little bit more interactive, make it a web-based resource with some printable documents integrated throughout. And it's going to provide just some more clarification on career pathways, some updates to work-based learning and continuum elements, and just other definitions that frankly the use in the field is changing or maybe different than when the dictionary was first put together. And for broader use, we want to make sure that the current use in the field is what's reflected in the dictionary to support the needs of districts that are working on their pathway plans. Next, we're going to transition into the Success Network Policy Committee. So we saw a space to launch the Success Network Policy Committee. The goal of this was to provide space for local practitioners, along with policy leaders, to collaborate, learn from one another, elevate local practices, and also use those practices to inform state policy, and just taking advantage of policy windows as they come up. Some of the ways that the policy committee is looking to do these things is by learning about new and emerging education and career policy efforts. Also, a big piece of this under the umbrella of the Success Network is that we really want to highlight leadership communities and some of the promising work that they're doing. Also engaging with data, we hold some regular data deep dive sessions in addition to our regular meetings with the policy committee. And then just identifying and advancing any emerging policy priorities. One of the key parts, I think, of the policy committee is hearing from people who are in the field what are challenges that are coming up that maybe could be addressed through policy. And then kind of identifying chances to innovate with policy in those regards. What we've done so far, so we launched this policy committee in December. So we've only had 2 meetings. So if you aren't on the policy committee and you would like to be, you can still join. In our meetings that we've had so far, we covered policy updates. So a lot of the things that we've talked about so far today. We also did a deep dive on some of the 2022 report card data and enrollment trends. If that is interesting to you and you were not able to attend it, there is a recording on the Success Network website that you can check out. And like I said before, we've already talked about some promising local practices because that's really a key component of this committee for us. Going forward, some of the things that we are looking to explore, professional development plans for dual credit. We've talked about it quite a bit. I know some people here have already asked questions about it. It's a big piece. So we definitely want to look into that a little bit deeper. Similarly, at our very first meeting of the policy committee, transportation was coming up a lot as a challenge that districts are having. So that's something we want to dive in a little bit deeper on, and launch even a transportation working group to look into that and talk about that at a little bit of a deeper level. And then just some other things, scaling of the pathway endorsement, again, along with the requirements in 3296, just support of that, and also exploring currency aspects. How can we motivate students? How can we motivate districts to implement these career pathway endorsements? And then looking into some of the declining post-secondary enrollment trends. This was another one that came out of our deep dive conversation. There was a lot of discussion over why we think this is happening, what we can do. So we want to take that further. Again, the mixed enrollment piece is really new territory. So we want to work on that. And then just continuing to engage with data that comes up around education and career success.
I'm going to add one more topic because it's come up approximately 15 times today, the SAT cut scores. So clearly bubbling up as a core issue that we want to talk about more and learn more from the field and from all of our colleagues that are on the committee and others. It's definitely open invite, but yeah, the SAT cut score is certainly bubbling up as another core policy issue here.
Yes, and our next meeting of the Success Network Policy Committee is coming up March 23rd. It's 1 to 2:30. It will be virtual. So if you are interested in joining the committee, these presentations will be shared. There is a link to our opt-in form, so you can just complete that. And then once we have your information, we'll send you more details about the meeting, as well as a link to register for that meeting and get the Zoom link and all of that. All right. We have
got some time.
discussion. Yeah, we do have some time.
So we've got some questions on the screen. I know we've blown through a lot of content, but a lot's happening. The moral of the story is a lot's happening, which is exciting. And it's really grounded in a lot of the work that you all do out in the field. But curious if there are, first of all, just like any questions to start, like as we've kind of rolled through a million updates around education and career work that's happening. Yes, Rusbe. He's not a plant, I promise. Yeah. The course types. Yeah. So the question is, I'm repeating the question because we're recording this and I don't know if it'll be audible to have the question. So the question is essentially, is there any work or initiatives underway to incentivize specific types of transitional math being offered? Is that a fair restatement?
Yeah, and maybe so that
to diversify the courses offered. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So my understanding is currently not necessarily, because it's like really a local determination thing, right? And a couple things. One, like when you think about the population of students who are needing remedial or developmental education coursework in math, what are the, thinking about really grounding the offerings and what are the pathways that those students are going to be going on to at the post-secondary level, right? And so that's why the transitional, math courses are what they are, right? So it's saying, okay, if you, like for me, for example, I will take my post-secondary journey. I was majoring in a liberal arts degree, ultimately. I did not need STEM or technical math, right? Like for me personally. So QL stats, like quantitative literacy or stats was the math that I would have needed in order to be able to successfully pass or, place into and pass the entry level math that I would have needed in my program of study, right? But that does not mean that there aren't students who are going to be going into STEM fields who would benefit from a transitional math course in STEM or technical math, depending on what their pathway is. I think it's a really worthwhile question. I'm curious if any of the districts in the room or any of the kind of community college partners who are in the room, how those conversations evolved locally around what transitional math course you decided to offer. And if there was a desire to offer more than one, and then you just kind of had to start with one. I think we find that some start with one, like quantitative literacy and stats, and then scale to others later. But Sarah, I see you had your hand up. And hold on one second. We'll bring you the mic so that we can hear you and everyone can hear you.
Thank you. So I'm from Lake County, and I know most of our districts started with QL and stats. There was some interest in the tech math pathway, but we found for us that pathway doesn't really make sense because a lot of the content is the same content covered in one of our classes that would count for credit for those students. So instead of the tech math pathway, we've been offering dual credit in comparable classes, and we really haven't had any interest in the STEM pathway. It just hasn't been a need that the districts have expressed to us. So that's where we are.
Any other questions to start, right? To start? Yeah. You say it out and I'll repeat it back and then we can make it easier for you. Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, how did the P20 Council land on the two areas of focus for that they are starting with, which is teacher pipeline and computer science? And we did not make that decision at Ed Systems. So that was a governor's office decision, right? So I'm not going to say your guess is as good as mine. I mean, we know that the teacher pipeline has been a major issue, right? And so, and to be clear, the conversations about teacher pipeline and about computer science have actually not necessarily been about pathways per se, but just more about computer science. How do we do a better job of delivering it in our schools? And Laura can speak, she's been involved in that project-based working group, so she can speak specifically to that. I know that the teacher pipeline work group was also considering what are, basically the charge of those project-based working groups was, what are the potential policy plays that we could make to help address the challenges in these two areas, right? I think that the computer science piece, my understanding is that it kind of came out of a lot of conversations around inconsistencies around computer science and like inequities in being able to deliver computer science across our state based on a variety of factors. And then the teacher pipeline issues, just because the teacher pipeline issue just stays huge. So, and so recognizing that that is a really critical area that our state needs to be addressing in any and all ways possible, right? And so pathways is one of those strategies. There, is conversation around kind of other incentive structures that they can think about. And I do believe that some of the bills that kind of are around teacher pipeline did emerge from that project-based working group as well, but I would need to confirm that. But Laura, maybe say a little bit more about the computer science one.
Yeah, I think Emily did a good intro to the computer science group. The other thing that I would say has been not by any means the only aspect, but a key aspect of that computer science working group and what they've been talking about and looking into has been about how can we integrate computer science into education earlier so that students are being introduced to those computer science concepts and what that consists of starting earlier, so that by the time they're looking at careers and pathways, they already have more of a computer science base. Because I think what they were finding was that students were, if they were getting introduced to computer science, it was in high school or when they went to college. So I think that it's just a lot of it is kind of that piece of working it into education earlier.
Yeah, and then the last thing I will say is that she's not in the room, so I can put her on the spot, but Mackenzie Eisen, who's in the governor's office, she's here. She'll be on our closing plenary panel. She's in a different room right now, but she is deeply involved in the P20 Council and helping manage it, so she would be another good person to talk to directly as well. But yeah, so I mean, I think something to consider for all of you in the room is like, what are the key pain points that you're having? And like, again, like what can we put the state muscle behind? Yeah.
I know that part of what that work group has been exploring is the challenge to find people who are qualified to teach those computer science courses. I don't know, Emily, if you have anything else to add on like more detail or specific things.
Yeah,
I mean, I know that's a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly like a squeeze point, right? Like a pressure point in the pipeline generally. I would say that in terms of getting employers to teach, there's a couple of potential avenues that come to mind for me but I love the way your brain works. So I would like for you to be in charge of things. So no, but one of those ways is CTE instructors, right? So like having, because the qualifications are slightly different for CTE instructors. And so that would be one way of doing it. Now, the computer science conversations that were happening through this project-based working group was not confined to CTE, but it's certainly a piece of the puzzle in my mind. So thinking about how that could be one of the strategies, right? And working with CPS and all that. I know you guys work closely with CPS on a number of different things. So thinking about what could it look like in that context? What can it look like in terms of potentially integrating it in through work-based learning that I know you guys are so deeply involved in, if that is one of the avenues, that kind of thing. I know that doesn't answer your question about how do employers deliver, I know it doesn't fully answer the question, but you're probing on something that's really valid, right? And that's part of why, you know, I know I mentioned a couple bills pertaining to manufacturing. That's why the IMA is pushing so hard to say, hey, can we subsidize manufacturing employees to be teachers in CTE and manufacturing? So we address the core need at the high school level. And so I could envision a world in which similarly, you know, a bill could be advanced around IT, right? Like, or a health science or, you know, that kind of thing. There are similar models, I believe in health science, but I'm not 100% positive on that. So don't quote me on that. But, you know, the idea of subsidizing wages for an industry leader to come in is not foreign to our state's kind of policy context. I know I saw a question over here. We probably have time for 2 more questions. We're not going to dismiss you early because lunch will be in here and we're supposed to keep you here for a minute. But I know I saw a question over here. Oh, no question over here. I did see another question. Yeah. Yeah, so a question is about earn and learn or apprenticeship models for students. Yes, it's happening. So moral of the story is yes, there are apprenticeship models for students. It's locally done, but there's a lot of funding that comes out, particularly from the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, because they hold most of the purse strings for workforce development dollars, but they make a lot of investments into youth programming in addition to adult programming. I would say and then the other piece is career development experiences, which are one of those core component parts of a college and career pathway endorsement, right? So having students in high quality, robust work-based learning, a CDE, there's a definition in the dictionary, all that kind of stuff, and it's statutorily defined. But the one of the key elements in a career development experience, and Heather Pensack from our team is here and is a wizard about all things work-based learning. So you should connect with Heather as well. But CDEs are part of the core component parts of that is it needs to be either for high school credit or money, right? Like we need to honor the student's experience and the student's work. So all of that being said, I would say that there are lots of pockets of really excellent work happening around the state. And Rush is a good example. You know, like there's folks in the room doing really robust work-based learning, and District 214 does a ton of apprenticeships. Apprenticeships are obviously like a pretty high bar in terms of like the amount of labor and work that goes into standing them up and the rigor of them. They're obviously high quality experiences, but when you think about scale, the most likely thing to scale is, you know, at the bottom of the pyramid is like career exploration, and then like team-based challenges, which are another component part of the CCPE, career development experiences, and then probably at the top of the pyramid, because it's just the most laborious and hardest to kind of pull off with a young person given scheduling and all that kind of stuff, would be apprenticeship. So there are a lot of models. I think in my mind, in my dream world, when I rule everything, just kidding, but in my dream world, you know, things like summer employment and stuff like that get pulled in as, you know, as credited as part of that as well, particularly if they're relevant. That's why they're a part of the college and career readiness indicator, is summer employment and like long, you know, like sustained employment. It could be, you know, even if you're working in a service job, you're still learning essential employability skills. So even though that might not go towards a college and career pathway endorsement, it can go to that readiness indicator. It's like you're a plant. So one great way is to join our policy committee, because like we are going to continuously be updating that group with like, hey, here's what's coming down the pipeline. Here's what's emerging. Here's what's changing. What do you think about this? What should we be pushing for? All that kind of stuff. So that is definitely a great way to stay in touch, because you know, we're trying to keep an eye on all these things, and it's a lot to keep track of. And we're constantly in conversation with other partners who are monitoring kind of other parts of the field too, and want to be able to kind of highlight their expertise as well. So even though it's a new body, we're trying to figure out how do we make it the most useful for folks in the field. Because the thing is, like, the state is and has been trying to do a lot of work to support the work that you guys do in this, just around the state, and making sense of these policy windows is a key mission of ours. So
one last note on that. I mentioned that the opt-in is in the presentation, but we also added, we have a whole policy committee page of the Success Network,
our website.
So you can find some of our past meetings, chance to get on the list, all of that right on its own tab.
Yeah. But I mean, as we wrap up, we can't say thank you enough for being here, being a part of the conference. And I just want to shout out Laura. This is her first, she's got all the ribbons because it's not only her first conference, but she's also part of the network organizers and also a speaker here. So just want to say thank you all so much for being a part of this today. And we couldn't do this work without you, and hopefully we can be supportive of the work you do.